Karen demands black man move his boat. Shocked to discover. He owns the entire lake and kicks out their fishing club. Imagine being told to move your own boat only to discover that you actually own the entire lake. What happens when a neighborhood's sense of entitlement crashes headfirst into decades of legacy and quiet power? This is the story of David Marshall, a man who faced down an HOA board, stood firm against judgment and assumptions, and reminded everyone that respect isn't given, it's earned. Stay tuned, because what unfolds next will challenge everything you thought about ownership, community, and standing your ground. It was just past 7 a.m. when David Marshall backed his truck into the gravel lot at Mayfield Lake just outside of Springfield, Missouri. The sun hadn't fully crested the tree line yet, and the water was still glassy, untouched. David, 47, had been looking forward to this morning for weeks. He'd spent most of the previous night prepping his old polished, he was just beginning to unhick. "You can't park that here," Karen Whitman called out sharply, her voice cutting through the morning calm like a David blinked. She marched closer, her tone more commanding. "This lot is private for community use only. You need to move that." David set the wrench down on the trailer hitch and stood up. "Morning. You live here, I'm on the HOA board," Karen said, emphasizing it as if that. He looked past her, scanning the lake's edge. "There's one posted near the pavilion," she replied flatly. "You must have David G. Well, you've got one now," she snapped, tapping her pen against the clipboard. David took a breath, trying to keep his tone level, despite the growing tension. "What's your name, Karen Whitman?" she said, standing taller, like she expected the name to mean something to him. "And yours, David Marshall," he replied calmly. She scribbled something. "That boat's registered to you, it is." "Well, David," her voice dripped with condescension, "I'm sure you're just unaware of the rules. But you can't just show up and dump your boat wherever you like. We've had issues before, people leaving trash, breaking things. This area is for residents and their guests under supervision." He watched her, carefully sensing the subtle venom behind the word people. He didn't say it aloud, but he felt the weight the way she looked at him, like she'd already decided who he was and what he represented. "I'm not breaking anything," he said firmly. "I'm just trying to enjoy the water. You need to pack up and leave now," she insisted. There was a long pause. David looked down at the gravel, then back at the lake. He turned to her again, voice steady but heavy with warning. "You sure you want to push this?" She blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" "You might want to double-check your information," he said evenly. "I think you're mistaken about who owns this lake." Karen actually laughed, sharp and shrill. "Is that supposed to intimidate me? Do you know how long I've lived here?" David didn't flinch. "Do you know who purchased this lake 3 years ago? Who maintains it, pays taxes on it, and signed off on your fishing club's access in the first place?" For a moment, her face shifted, a flicker of uncertainty, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "You're bluffing," she said. David walked back to his trailer and clipped the line back onto the boat. "All right. You do what you have to do." "I will," she said, a thin threat beneath her words. But David wasn't bluffing, and Karen had just started a fight she wasn't prepared for. By 9 a.m., David was already on the water, drifting near the reeds at the lake's eastern edge. He cast his line quietly, not in a rush, not even really expecting to catch much. The air was cool and calm, but his peace didn't last long. A white golf cart appeared near the dock. From a distance, David could already tell who it was. Same posture, same quick movements. Karen Whitman, but this time she wasn't alone. A man with a windbreaker and a radio clipped to his belt sat beside her, likely one of the HOA's contracted security guys. They stopped at the edge of the dock. Karen planted her feet wide like she was commanding a courtroom. "David Marshall," she shouted across the water, "this is your final warning." David reeled in his line, slowly turned his chair and waved. "Morning again, Karen. I've contacted the sheriff's office. You're in violation of HOA regulations. You are to leave the premises immediately." The man beside her looked uncertain, leaned toward her and whispered something, but Karen shook her head, cutting him off. David stayed seated, calm hands folded in his lap. "That man with you, he called out he got a badge or just a walkie?" Karen stiffened. "You don't need to worry about that." "Well," David called out, "if you're going to accuse someone of trespassing on private land, you might want to make sure you're not the one trespassing first." The security guard, young, probably mid-20s, finally stepped forward. "Sir, can I ask what your business is on the lake?" David nodded. "You can ask." "I'm fishing." "Are you a resident of Mayfield Hills?" "No." "Then I'm going to have to ask you to come ashore." David pulled his tackle box closer, not getting up. "Ever hear of Crescent Holdings?" The young man paused. "Can't say I have." "Figures." David said, "They're a private trust. They bought this land and the lake 3 years ago. It's owned and managed by them. I'm the sole trustee." Karen scoffed. "What, you expect us to believe?" That David smiled. "Don't really care what you believe. The paperwork's filed with the Greene County Recorder's Office. All public record. You can look it up right now." The security guy looked at Karen, then back at David. "Do you have identification on you in the truck? I'll need to see it." David didn't move. "I'll show it to a deputy when they get here. That's who you called, right?" The guard shifted uncomfortably. Karen, on the other hand, doubled down. "This lake has been part of our community for decades," she snapped. "Just because some shell company buys the land doesn't mean you can roll in here, act like you own it, and disrupt our peace." "Ma'am," David said with a steady tone, "I didn't disrupt anything. You came to me." Her face flushed. "You know what, fine? Let's let the sheriff sort it out. But don't expect sympathy when they show up." David leaned back in his chair, casting another line, not looking for sympathy, just some peace and quiet. But Karen couldn't let it go, because this wasn't just about a boat, it was about control, and she was starting to lose hers. By the time David packed up his gear and drove home that afternoon, the sun beat down hard, and the silence in his truck was a welcome relief. The old leather seats creaked under his weight as he sank back, exhaling slowly, letting the quiet settle. He wasn't angry yet, but something in him stirred. Not bitterness, not resentment, just a quiet, rising reminder of what this lake meant and why he was there. His house sat about 10 minutes away, tucked just off a rural stretch of County Road 102. Nothing fancy, modest, single-story, pale green with fading white trim. The kind of house built more for living than for showing off. His dog Buddy barked once from the porch as David pulled in. David waved and gave a faint smile, but didn't linger outside. Inside, he kicked off his boots, tossed his keys onto the hook, and grabbed a framed photo off the shelf near the front door. It was old, faded edges, a soft crease running down the middle. His father stood barefoot by the lake, holding a fish up with both hands, grinning like he'd just won the lottery. David was no older than 10 in that photo, smiling up at him with grass-stained jeans and crooked teeth. "Dad," he muttered under his breath, "you'd have handled her a lot better than I did." He poured himself a glass of iced tea and sat at the kitchen table for a while. He didn't move. He just sat there thinking about the look on Karen's face, the absolute certainty in her voice, the way she wrote his name down like he was some trespasser with bad intentions. She didn't care who he was. She didn't ask. She just assumed. David stood up, walked to the filing cabinet in the hallway, and slid open the bottom drawer. Inside was a blue folder marked Mayfield Lake Title and Access. He pulled it out, laid it flat on the dining table, and flipped it open. There, it was deed transfer from the previous landowner's signatures from Crescent Holdings. His name as trustee, assigned agreement between the HOA and the holding company, granting conditional use of the lake to the community's fishing club, renewable annually, but subject to review. No renewal had been filed in the last 10 months. He chuckled dryly. Guess they forgot who they were dealing with. The lake wasn't public. Never had been. The old owners had allowed the neighborhood access out of generosity. David's father, before his death, had helped build that understanding. He believed people should be able to share in nature as long as they respected it. But after David inherited the trust, the same people who once shook his father's hand had become quiet, distant. A few waves here and there, no real effort to get to know him. Except Karen, of course. She'd never even made eye contact. He looked over the paperwork again. There were no technicalities, no loopholes. The access was a courtesy, not a right, and he had every legal standing to revoke it if necessary. Still, David didn't want to act on impulse that wasn't his way. He wanted to give the benefit of the doubt. But this wasn't just about one woman's rude behavior. It was about something bigger: entitlement, about respect. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in a while. "Hey, mister," Lang, he said when the voice answered. "Yeah, I know it's been a minute. Listen, I need a favor. Can you pull up the HOA agreement file from 3 years ago, specifically the fishing access clause? Yeah, I've got the physical copy here, but want to double-check a couple things with you." He paused, listening. No rush, but yeah, it's time I take a closer look at who's been taking advantage of what my father left behind. But as David hung up the phone, he had no idea just how deep the entitlement in that neighborhood ran, or how loud it would get when someone finally said no. It was early Monday morning when David stopped by the Greene County Recorder's office. He didn't really need to. He already had the documents at home, but something told him this time he needed things to be official, clean, and bulletproof. He stood at the counter waiting patiently while the clerk pulled up the parcel records. A few clicks later, the screen lit up with his name, the property description, and a scanned copy of the deed. Everything was black and white. The lake, the dock, the entire surrounding green belt, all his held under the Crescent Holdings Trust. No overlapping claims, no shared easements, no community ownership, the clerk said with a polite smile. David nodded firmly. That's exactly what I needed. When he got back in his truck, he took a deep breath. This wasn't about revenge. Not really. It was about respect. Karen Whitman hadn't just questioned his right to be on the water, she'd looked him in the eye and decided he didn't belong. And no matter how calm he'd stayed, her tone had made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. Back at home, David opened his laptop and pulled up a blank document. He started drafting a letter, direct, professional, and to the point. It was addressed to the Mayfield Hills Homeowners Association and its board members. He cited the terms of the original access agreement, emphasized the fact that no renewal request had been submitted for the current year, and stated that effective immediately public access to the lake through HOA or club channels would be suspended until further notice. No angry language, no threats, just a clear revocation of access backed by solid documentation. He attached scanned copies of the original contract, the deed, and a notarized statement of his trustee status. By the time he was done, the message was airtight. David printed the letter, slid it along with the supporting documents into a thick envelope, and drove it down to the HOA office himself. The building was a beige single-story tucked behind the subdivision's main gates. The parking lot was empty except for 2 cars. He walked inside and handed the envelope to the receptionist without a word. "Do you want a receipt?" she asked, clearly caught off guard. David looked her in the eye. "Just make sure Karen gets it." That evening back at home, David sat out on the porch with Buddy at his feet. The sun was setting across the tops of the trees, casting golden light across the lawn. For the first time in days, David felt a flicker of peace until his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Marshall," a man's voice asked on the other end. "This is Ron Castile. I'm the acting president of the Mayfield Hills HOA board. We received your letter today." David stayed quiet. Ron continued. "Look, we'd like to discuss this. Maybe there was a miscommunication somewhere. No need to escalate things." "There's nothing escalated about it," David replied calmly. "The agreement wasn't renewed. Access was being used without permission. I've simply brought it back in line with the terms." "I understand," Ron said quickly, "but revoking access completely might not sit well with some residents. We've had use of that lake for years, and I haven't interfered." David said, "After the way your board member approached me on Saturday, I think it's best we take a pause." There was a pause. "Well, Would you be open to meeting? Maybe find a compromise. David took a long sip of water before responding. Let's see how folks handle a little humility first. He hung up without waiting for a reply. But the letter had only just landed, and David had no idea the ripple it would cause behind those gates. By Wednesday morning, David couldn't even pull into the grocery store parking lot without catching stares. It started with emails, short passive-aggressive notes from board members written in the kind of polite language people use when they're trying not to show how furious they really are. Then came the phone calls, some blocked, some from numbers David hadn't dialed in years. What surprised him most were the whispers. People who had barely spoken to him since the day he bought the property now watched him with wary eyes. At the hardware store, a man with a gray beard and oil-stained overalls approached near the screws and fasteners aisle. "You David Marshall?" he asked, tilting his head. "I am David," replied cautiously. The man extended his hand. "Name's Billy Waller. I live on Valley Crest Drive, been here about 20 years. Heard what happened Saturday." David shook his hand but didn't say much. Billy continued. "Just wanted to say not all of us feel the way Karen does. She's had a habit of thinking she runs this whole place." David gave a short nod. "I appreciate that. She even told my wife last year our front porch furniture didn't match the neighborhood aesthetic. Imagine that." Billy laughed bitterly. "A chair is a chair. You either sit on it or you don't." David cracked a smile. "I'll keep that in mind." That wasn't the only encounter. At the post office, someone left an unsigned note in David's P.O. box. "She doesn't speak for everyone," said a middle-aged woman at the gas station, waving at him, then quickly looking away when he didn't wave back. People were testing the waters, trying to feel him out. But not everyone was trying to play nice. That afternoon, someone slid a flyer into his mailbox, no stamp, no envelope. It was printed on standard paper with a bold heading, "Local man revokes community lake access, retaliation, or power grab." David stood on his porch, reading it, shaking his head slowly. Beneath the headline was a small paragraph suggesting he was using his position as a weapon against the community, calling his actions disruptive and unnecessary. There was no name listed, no one to call or question. But it didn't take a genius to guess who'd written it. Later that evening, David walked Buddy down the gravel path that led to the lake. He passed a couple standing near the waterline. They didn't speak, just watched him as he walked by. Their fishing poles rested against the rocks. When he got back home, David sat on his porch and watched the sunset again. He wasn't looking for a fight. He hadn't started one. But it was clear the neighborhood didn't take kindly to the reminder that access was a privilege, not a guarantee. The next morning, David received a call from a young woman named Andrea Preston. She lived on Lilac Bend Lane and had recently been voted onto the HOA board after a string of resignations. "I just want to apologize," Andrea said, her voice sincere but cautious. "I wasn't there Saturday, but I've heard about everything. Karen doesn't speak for everyone, and frankly, some of us are embarrassed." David kept his voice calm and steady. "That's good to hear." There was a brief pause before Andrea continued. "There's talk of calling an emergency board meeting. Some want to reverse your decision. Others think we should formally reach out and negotiate a new agreement." David's reply was firm. "I'm not interested in negotiating. I'm interested in respect." Andrea hesitated before replying, "I understand. But some folks aren't going to let this go quietly, and I'm afraid that scene is coming fast." By Friday morning, the HOA office was buzzing not with cheer, but with tension so thick it could almost be tasted. David's letter had circulated widely. Copies were passed hand to hand at backyard barbecues and forwarded through endless email chains. Whispers filled neighborhood walks. Every member of the fishing club had read it, and nobody had anything neutral to say. Inside the HOA meeting room, a modest space with beige walls and mismatched chairs, Karen Whitman stood at the head of the table, arms folded tightly, lips pressed in a hard line. She hadn't spoken officially yet, but everyone knew she was seething. Ron Castile sat beside her, rubbing the bridge of his nose. We all read the letter Ron said finally, his voice low and weary, and whether we like it or not, David Marshall is within his rights. One older member, Don Keeling, shifted in his seat. So what, we just let him lock us out of the lake? Like we're trespassers, Karen's eyes narrowed. He wants to make a point, that much is clear. No, Andrea said from the far end of the table. He wants respect. And after what happened last weekend, I don't think he's out of line. Karen turned sharply. Are you taking his side? Andrea didn't flinch. I'm not taking sides. I'm looking at the facts. The agreement expired and we didn't renew it. That's on us. But this affects the whole community. Karen snapped back. That lake has been part of Mayfield Hills for decades. Families fish there, kids swim in the summer. He can't just cut everyone off because he got his feelings hurt. Ron glanced at her. This didn't start because of feelings. It started because you accused the man of trespassing on land he owns. For a moment, the room went quiet. Meanwhile, David was back at the lake standing on the dock with a clipboard of his own. He wasn't patrolling or watching for trouble. He was taking inventory damage to the fencing trash left behind 2 broken benches near the fire pit, all things the HOA hadn't fixed in over a year, despite the access agreement clearly placing that responsibility on them. A truck slowed down behind him. The driver leaned out the window. It was Billy Waller again. You sure you want to poke this hornet's nest? He asked. David didn't look up. I didn't poke anything. I just stopped letting people stomp through my yard without asking. Billy chuckled softly. That afternoon, a notice went out, formally posted on the HOA bulletin board, sent via email, and slipped into residents' mailboxes in plastic sleeves to keep the rain off. The message was clear. Effective immediately, access to Mayfield Lake is suspended pending review and renegotiation with Crescent Holdings. Residents are asked not to use the dock shoreline or common greenbelt areas unless otherwise notified. Violations may result in trespass enforcement. The neighborhood's reaction was swift. A woman in her 60s stormed into the HOA office demanding answers. Teenagers were seen arguing with parents near the trail entrance. Online forums lit up with speculation, frustration, and half-baked legal theories. One post even claimed David was secretly planning to sell the lake to a private developer, though no one could say where that rumor came from. That night, David sat on his porch again, the sky darkening above him as the last light faded behind the trees. Andrea Preston approached quietly, knocking gently, and staying a respectful step back. I wanted to check in, she said softly, and ask if you'd be willing to speak at the upcoming HOA meeting. David raised an eyebrow silently, asking, Speak about what? Whatever you think they need to hear, Andrea replied. They don't know you. They only know Karen's version. David paused, weighing the request carefully. After a moment, he nodded slowly. All right, I'll come. Agreeing to show up was one thing. Facing a room full of angry neighbors was another entirely. The community room at Mayfield Hills filled faster than anyone expected. Folding chairs were pulled from closets, neighbors stood along the back wall, and some even lingered outside the open doors. There hadn't been a turnout like this in years, not for budget talks, not even for pool renovations. But tonight, everyone wanted to hear what David Marshall had to say. He stood near the front, off to the side, wearing jeans and a simple button-up shirt. No podium, no notes, just himself calm and steady, watching the crowd. Karen Whitman sat dead center in the front row, arms crossed tightly, jaw set like concrete. Behind her were faces David recognized, some vaguely, some not at all. Most remained quiet. A few avoided his gaze altogether. Ron Castile stepped forward first. Thanks for coming, everyone, Ron began, voice low and tired. I know this wasn't a scheduled meeting, but we felt it was important to address the concerns raised about lake access and recent events. He glanced toward David, who gave a small, appreciative nod. Ron cleared his throat again. David Marshall has agreed to speak tonight. I ask that we all keep things respectful. David stepped forward but didn't speak immediately. He looked around the room, meeting eyes where he could. My father used to bring me to this lake when I was 10. He began, voice calm but strong. That was before this neighborhood existed. We'd fish in the mornings, cook on the shore in the afternoons. A murmur ran through the crowd. Heads tilted, people listened. I learned how to tie my first fishing line right here. He paused, letting the memories settle. I bought the lake 3 years ago through a trust that honors his legacy. I kept access open to the community, no fees, no conditions, just expected folks to treat it with care. David's voice tightened slightly. But when someone walks up to you, demands you leave, threatens to call the cops on your own property, that's not just about rules. That's about disrespect. A woman in the back spoke up. She didn't even ask who you were. David looked at her. She didn't try to argue. This isn't about punishing the community, he continued. It's about accountability. You've been using something that doesn't belong to you without maintaining it, without renewing the agreement, and from what I've seen, without even thinking about who's behind it. He stepped back, not seeking the spotlight. I didn't want it to come to this, but I'm not going to apologize for asking to be treated like a person. That last sentence hit harder than he expected. A few people lowered their heads. One woman whispered to her husband. Then Karen stood. "Why didn't you just come to us?" she asked tightly. "Why go straight to shutting everyone out?" David met her gaze squarely. "You came to me first on the dock with a clipboard and a threat." She opened her mouth but said nothing. She slowly sat back down. Ron stepped forward again. "We're going to open discussion now. No shouting. Keep it constructive." Several hands shot up. An older man in a fishing hat said, "I don't care who owns what, that lake is part of this neighborhood's life. Kids have grown up on it." David replied evenly. "Then maybe the neighborhood should care enough to respect the person who's kept it open all this time." Another woman asked, "Would you consider renewing the agreement if the HOA handled maintenance and put real guidelines in place?" David hesitated, feeling the weight of the room. They weren't just mad anymore. They were listening. "I'll consider it," he said quietly. "But I'm not rushing. Not until I know folks understand that this isn't just land, it's personal." In the days that followed, an unusual quiet settled over Mayfield Hills. The hostile flyers in David's mailbox stopped. The anonymous calls ceased. The whispers among neighbors softened, replaced by contemplative glances and cautious nods. The same lake that had stirred so much conflict just a week ago now mirrored only the calm sky and towering trees. David didn't expect an apology from Karen Whitman, and he didn't get one. But she had stepped back, no longer leading the charge, and word spread quickly that she had resigned from the HOA board to focus on personal matters, though everyone knew the real reason. One Saturday morning, David returned to the dock with a toolbox and a bucket of paint, Jasper trotting happily at his side, tail wagging. The benches were still broken, the fencing still loose. But David wasn't bitter. He wasn't here for a fight. He was here to heal something much deeper for himself and for the memory of his father. Midway through, replacing a rotted plank, footsteps approached behind him. "Need a hand?" Andrea Preston called, stepping up in jeans and sneakers sleeves rolled up. She carried a bag of screws and a cordless drill. David nodded toward the bench. "You know how to work that thing I do?" Andrea grinned. "You wouldn't believe how much HOA paperwork I fixed with this drill last year." David laughed softly, motioning toward the broken bench. "Be my guest." They worked quietly, side by side, the silence between them comfortable and respectful. After about 20 minutes, Andrea finally spoke. "There's a lot of people in the neighborhood who want to make things right," she said. David didn't look up. "It takes more than good intentions," he replied. "I know," Andrea said. "That's why I've been talking with the new board. We're drafting a revised agreement, one that includes maintenance cleanup schedules and a rotating committee for oversight." David paused, then looked at her. "No more clipboards and threats. No more," she promised. "And any violations will be handled internally. You won't be bothered." David nodded slowly. I'll read it when it's ready. Later that afternoon, another surprise arrived. Billy Waller came back this time with his teenage grandson, Lucas. The kid held a trash bag in one hand and gloves in the other. We figured we'd help out a little, Billy said. Might not fix everything, but it's a start. David said nothing, just handed Lucas a rake and pointed toward the trail where broken glass had collected near the brush. By sundown, the dock looked new again. The benches were sturdy, the path cleared, and for the first time since the whole mess began, David felt something shift, not just in the place around him, but in the people too. The next morning at church, a few heads turned as David walked in. Some nodded politely. One woman leaned over to whisper, "That lake is lucky to have you." David smiled quietly, even though he didn't know her name. After the service, a man David didn't recognize approached him in the parking lot, tall, balding, with glasses sliding down his nose. "You're David Marshall, right?" the man asked. "I am. I live 2 streets down. Just wanted to say my kid caught his first fish at that lake last summer. Never got a chance to thank you for keeping it open." David didn't need the thanks, but it meant something not just because it was sincere, but because it came without being forced. That night, as he walked Jasper along the gravel trail, David thought about his father again. The smell of fresh-cut grass, the sound of a fishing reel spinning the stillness of early morning water. His father had once told him people don't always know the value of something until it's nearly gone. David understood that now more than ever. But he realized something deeper, too. Respect isn't handed out in letters or meetings. It's earned plank by plank, person by person, choice by choice. A week later, David stood alone at the edge of Mayfield Lake. The air was crisp, the water still, and the sunrise painted long streaks of gold and orange across the surface. He hadn't brought his fishing rod this time. He didn't need it. He just stood quietly listening, not to the birds or the breeze, but to the absence of noise. In a plastic folder under his arm was the revised access agreement. Andrea and the new board had worked hard on it. This time, there were clear terms, scheduled maintenance days, a 3-strike policy for littering, a mandatory renewal every 12 months with no automatic carryovers, and most importantly, every HOA fishing club member would have to complete a short orientation before using the lake. Nothing fancy, just a reminder of the lake's history, who owned it, and what it stood for. David didn't do this for control. He didn't even do it for an apology that never came. He did it because letting people walk all over something precious doesn't just damage the place, it changes how you see yourself. And David wasn't about to let one woman's entitlement rewrite a legacy built over decades. Later that day, he returned to the neighborhood clubhouse where the new board waited for his signature. A few familiar faces were there, some friendly, some unsure, but none hostile. As David signed the last page, Andrea leaned in. "We're going to do better," she said. David nodded. "I'll hold you to that." On the way out, he passed a small group of teenagers gathered near the bulletin board. They went quiet when they saw him, unsure what to say. Then one of them, a lanky boy with a fishing hat too big for his head, stepped forward. "Mr. Marshall," the boy said. David paused. "My dad told me you fixed the dock. Said I should thank you." David gave a small smile. "Just take care of it." "We will," the boy said quickly, a promise in his voice. Walking back to his truck, David felt something ease in his chest, the kind of peace that doesn't come from winning, but from being understood, even if only a little. He thought again about that Saturday morning, about Karen storming up with her clipboard, about how quickly she made up her mind about him. He hadn't yelled, hadn't pushed back with fire. He'd let the truth and the law speak for themselves. And in the end, that was enough. The lake had taught him something. Sometimes the best way to earn respect isn't to demand it, it's to walk with it quietly, firmly, and let others catch up. And maybe, just maybe, by standing still, you make enough noise for change. If you've ever been in a situation where someone underestimated you, where you were dismissed before anyone even asked your name, remember this: silence doesn't mean weakness, and standing your ground with dignity speaks louder than any argument. If this story moved, you subscribe to the channel. There are more stories like this, real stories, human stories, lessons worth remembering. This story reminds us that sometimes standing quietly with dignity speaks louder than the loudest voice in the room. David Marshall didn't shout or rage, he showed us how respect is earned, not demanded. It's a powerful lesson about legacy patience and the courage to hold your ground even when others doubt you. If this story touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Soulful Stories Full for more stories that celebrate strength, truth, and the human spirit. But let's be honest, not everyone will agree. Some say David was too patient. Others think he should have fought harder. What do you think was standing firm enough, or should he have pushed back more aggressively? Drop your thoughts below. We want to hear your side. Thank you for being part of this journey. Together we remind the world that true strength is soulful, silent, and steady.